is going to be a two-part lecture I'll have on the conquistadors and the so-called conquest of America. So I'll kind of get into like the early half of that. A lot of that will be more or less talking about a lot of the early explorers, the Spanish that came into North America and Mexico, because they're kind of important in spearheading, the Europeans that come in later at colonize the Americas. Of course, that started pretty much in the 16th century after Columbus. So anyway, yeah, of course, in the study about the early 16th century, you get the arrival of the so-called conquistadors that come in, which of course the Spanish called them a long time ago, and oftentimes the Spanish called this whole thing the La Conquista, which in Spanish that means the conquest, and most of that occurred between, I guess, the 16th and the 17th centuries, as the Spanish and other Europeans began to explore and take over the Americas. And of course, the conquistadors, kind of the ones that spearheaded. The conquistadors were these soldiers of fortune that were seeking lands to conquer. Gold was one of the main things that they wanted or sought. And part of the reason why this happened was that the fact that Spain had so many soldiers. If you study about it between the 15th and 16th century, that were left over from what they call the Reconquista. That was where the Spanish had basically conquered all of Spain from Islam, which I think took like 700-800 years. And so it basically created and bred soldiers. A lot of soldiers, pretty much the Spanish were just hardcore soldiers. And so these are the men that'll eventually spearhead the whole conquest of the Americas overall. Of course, you see here those two right there, Hernan Cortes, Francisco Pizarro. I think those two are usually considered to be the most famous, the most successful of the conquistadors. Cortes, I think, is more notorious, but Pizarro is pretty ruthless in his conquest of Peru. And then Cortes, was famous for his conquest of Mexico and all that. Now, I'll kind of get into, of course, one of the things that a lot of the, Spanish were fueled by when they, came to the Americas was gold. I think there was a famous quote that Hernan Cortes said once where he said, we Spaniards know a sickness of the heart where only gold can cure. And so that's something that they actually told a lot of the Native Americans, because a lot of the Native Americans didn't really understand why the Europeans wanted gold so much. What was the deal? They didn't understand the value of it. And so Cortes was saying, we have an illness of the heart and we need gold to cure it. And so that was the excuse basically to do it. But yeah, there were all kinds of legends that really influenced a lot of the Spanish, when they came to the Americas. The legend of El Dorado, which if you want the translation, it means either the golden man or the gilded man. And it was this legend that there was some lost city of gold that existed, they think, in South America. And it was led by this king who they called El Dorado. The actual kingdom, I'm not sure what they called it, but he was named El Dorado. And there was a lot of people that searched for it. I'll kind of show images right here, but there was a man named Francisco de Orellana. You may have heard of him. He was a conquistador in the 16th century. And Orellana was famous for being the first European to explore the Amazon River basin, which he did in the 1540s. I think he reached the mouth of Amazon in 1542. And so he was searching for this El Dorado, or also Cibola, I think is another term they sometimes use for these lost cities of gold there. But of course, Coronado is another figure too that also searched too for lost cities of gold. So I think they call that one Cibola is another one that's kind of famous as well. But here's an image of, I guess, of the Amazon River basin and all that. Yeah, Sir Walter Raleigh, I think, searched for lost cities of gold. in South America. They think in the Amazon, I want to say in 1595 as well. So you had all these different people that searched, for El Dorado and all that. Actually, there's actually near, I think I want to say close to Bogota in Colombia. There's actually a lake there called Lake Guadavita, and they think that that lake might be where they kind of get the whole legend of El Dorado, because they believed it was some kind of lake where the king would, I think he had some kind of ritual where he would cover himself with gold dust, jewels, and he would dive into the pool. And so they think a lot of this gold and whatever washed down to the bottom of it, and all that. And so that's kind of where I guess that legend came from that. Of course, they made movies about, El Dorado, the road to El Dorado. You may have seen that also, which is, I think, came out in 2000 from DreamWorks, which I think was kind of controversial, but they made cartoons about it. I know General Motors Cadillac had Cadillac El Dorado. I guess kind of where the name maybe comes from or whatever. Kind of a nice car there, huh? Convertible. But yeah, they had that too, also as well. They had Cibola, which kind of mentioned briefly about that. That was a similar legend that's kind of, they think, may have originated in, they want to say, the old world. I think going back to like the stories of Herodotus and others, Prester John, and all that. And so they had these legends that there were seven cities of gold that existed in the New World. I think the Spanish called it Cibola y Quivera or something like that. And so I think Coronado and others, of course, search for it. If you know about that, like we talked about before. Now I'll talk more about Coronado later, about that. Of course, one of the first, conquistadors you really hear about is Juan Ponce de Leon, who, of course, came to the Americas in the early 1500s. If you know about Juan Ponce de Leon, he was, of course, a conquistador that originally came with Christopher Columbus on his second voyage to the Americas, which I think I want to say around 1493. And what he's famous for now, if you know about it, Ponce de Leon is the one that discovered what we now call Florida, which the Spanish originally thought that Florida was an island and not a peninsula, I guess, at the bottom of, where the United States is today. And he had helped Columbus conquer Puerto Rico, and then he became like the governor of it. And then he heard about this legend, like the so-called maybe Fountain of Youth. They may have existed to the north, close to where the Bahamas is. And so he took a fleet of ships and he sailed up through the Bahamas, which where Florida is. And he found it like in, I think, April of 1513 is when he discovered it. They do think that he came ashore, by the way, close to where, here's, by the way, an image of the Fountain of Youth right here. Yeah, they do think it's a legend. They think it goes back to the ancient or medieval times. It almost seems like the Holy Grail kind of myth too, where you might drink from like the Holy Grail and have eternal youth or something like that. But these are ideas that have been circulating of course, in Europe. But they think it's a legend, and most likely he was probably searching for gold, land, and things like that, and not really that issue. But you can see a map showing you, the actual route that he took up through the Atlantic. And they do think he landed near St. Augustine, Florida, which you see right here. They later on, the Spanish would come back and found that city there in 1565. And it is considered the oldest city, of course, in the United States, of course, on the Atlantic coast there. So it's a kind of well-known city today. So that's up. He's kind of known for, basically Juan Ponce de Leon. Now you also got Vasco Nunez de Balboa. He's another famous explorer and conquistador that also came early on to the Americas. He's kind of around the same time of when Juan Ponce de Leon is starting to explore Florida. He actually would get killed, I think, on a second voyage. Juan Ponce de Leon in 1521, I believe, when he also explored Florida a second time later. But if you study about Vasco Nunez de Balboa, he's famous for discovering the Pacific Ocean, which he did in 1513. He was, if you study about him, he was one of the first Europeans to actually go to Panama in Central America. And he took some men and he crossed the Isthmus of Panama, which, connects, I guess, Central America with South America, because he had heard from the natives that there was a ocean or sea that was on the other side. And so he crossed it in 1513. And he would actually call it the South Sea, or I think Mar del Sur, I think was the original name, but they called it Sea of the South or something like that. I think it was the nickname. And then Magellan would later call it Pacific Ocean, I think around 2021. So yeah, and kind of another image I think I've got right here showing this, but yeah, there's kind of a map of Panama right there. So almost 200 men across the Isthmus of Panama. He also explored the Pearl Islands, which are kind of like south of Panama right there. So you can kind of see why he called it the South Sea, because it was kind of Pacific Ocean was kind of looking southward, of course, from there. And so hence the name being used there. We'll talk later. There's a conquistador that comes with him named Francisco Pizarro. Pizarro later end up in Panama. And he later goes down into South America and conquers, if you know about this, Peru and the Inca Empire, which will be, of course, a little later. Now, another expedition that was kind of famous also early on with the conquistadors that went into North America was the one of the Narvaez expedition that kind of took place between the 1520s and the 1530s. I've got the dates right here. And Pamphilo Narvaez was this conquistador that had helped Cortes conquer Mexico a few years before. And he was given a commission to explore what they call Florida, which is what they call that part of North America, later what they call, I guess, Spanish Florida, etc. And so he got an expedition together of ships with like about 500 men, and they sailed from the Caribbean up to Florida, basically. And what happened was his expedition got wiped out near Tampa Bay. They're called I think it's called the Bay of Horses, I think it is, in Tampa. And anyway, they lost most of their ships and their men and their horses. And what ended up happening was only 4 men survived out of the whole expedition. They think a hurricane probably wiped out their expedition. And one of the men that survived was a man named Alvar Nunez, who was later known as Cabeza de Vaca, which was a nickname he was called. They later ended up in Texas, in Galveston Island, I believe, the actual expedition, and kind of show a map of the expedition from there. But so from Tampa Bay, they ended up over here where Galveston is, and they actually got enslaved by Indians. Believe it or not, the 4 men that survived, I think for a few years they were captives of Indians there, and then they were able to escape. And then from there, what he did, if you know about it, he then, Cabeza de Vaca, then explored the region of the southern United States, like into western Texas. I think he went into New Mexico, and then he explored down into the northern area of Mexico today. And Cabeza de Vaca was one of the first Europeans to give like an account of like the Native American cultures that were kind of living there. And so he was kind of like this proto-anthropologist, studying about Indian cultures and learn their languages and things like that. And he later came back and he wrote a book about it, which I think the book has different names, but at least it's called the La Relation, of the account of Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, which, by the way, I didn't really tell you this, but Cabeza de Vaca was a nickname that meant head of a cow. You get the name there, little picture there, right there. But he was called that because he had I think a cow's head, or I think it was a cow's skull that was in his coat of arms, and so that's why they called him that, Cabeza de Vaca. But that book I just told you, which was published in 1542, influenced other conquistadors to come back and explore. I think especially Coronado, etc. And so the travels of Cabeza de Vaca were kind of famous at that time. They had another explorer. I think everybody's heard of him, which is Hernando de Soto, who explored the Mississippi River basin later. He's very famous conquistador that was around in the early 1500s. He wasn't just known for exploring now what we call the Gulf region of the United States, like above the Gulf of Mexico, which he did. You can see in the 1540s. He was a very famous conquistador at the time. In fact, actually pretty wealthy, Hernando de Soto, if you study about him. He was involved in a lot of different expeditions throughout the New World, and I guess aiding the Spanish into conquering parts of like Latin America. And in the 1510s and the 1520s, De Soto was very famous for helping this conquistador named Francisco Cordoba conquer like Nicaragua. And then from there, they went up into like Central America, into like also the Yucatan. They, of course, the Spanish by the 1520s began, taking over the Yucatan, southern Mexico. And then Cortez will come behind that and, of course, eventually conquer also central Mexico as well. De Soto was also involved in the conquest of Peru in the Inca Empire in the 1530s. He aided Francisco Pizarro in defeating them. So you can see how he got so wealthy in all that. And then the last expedition he went on, of course, was the one when he explored the Gulf South, of course, where the United States is. You can see the route that De Soto took starting in 1540. He would explore pretty much all the major cities of the U.S. South that we have today. He'll explore Florida. He starts from Florida. They think coming up through where Tallahassee they think is. They think he kind of his expedition went through there into Georgia, then up through the Carolinas, South and North Carolina. They think into part of eastern Tennessee, and then down into Alabama. And then you can see he also went up into, at one point, parts of Mississippi and Arkansas. There's a debate about whether he got into Louisiana or not, but they do think he explored also the eastern part of also Texas as well. You can see the most famous thing, though, that he did was in 1541. If you know about this, De Soto was one of the first Europeans to discover, the Mississippi River, which he did in that year in 1541. And they think it was near Memphis, Tennessee, where he crossed the Mississippi River, which at the time, by the way, the Mississippi was really wide. If you know where the Mississippi Delta is up there in Mississippi, it was kind of that wide at the time. And where that bridge is you're looking at, which is the Hernando de Soto Bridge, which, by the way, is part of Interstate 40 going between Arkansas and Tennessee. That's basically around that location of where maybe that Hernando de Soto may have crossed at that point. I think that bridge was completed, I want to say in 1973. That's when it was built, and so it's kind of named after him, of course. De Soto died of natural causes, and there's, of course, if you know about the story about this, they buried him in the river or near the riverbank. They didn't want the natives to know that he died, because I think a lot of the Spanish would tell them that they were gods or something like that, so they wouldn't attack him. But I think he died of natural causes on the actual expedition. Now, another famous conquistador who was ruthless, by the way, was Francisco Coronado, who I did want to talk about a little bit for today. Coronado's expedition happened around the same time when De Soto was exploring like the southeastern part of the United States, of course, today. Who was Coronado? Coronado, besides being a conquistador, was a governor that was in the northern part of Mexico. an area that was called New Galicia, which was like this little province of Mexico that he was the viceroy of. It was kind of like northwestern part of Mexico on the Pacific Ocean. And what happened was he heard this story about Cabeza de Vaca, about how he'd come back and had survived that expedition of Narvaez, and he'd written that book. Anyway, he wanted to basically go and find, the so-called what he thought was the lost cities of gold, or Cibola, as it was called. So I think one of the things that Cabeza de Vaca talked about was that some of the Indian villages, it looked like some of their cities might be these gold cities that they're talking about. And so he ends up exploring like the southwestern regions, of course, of the United States. Here's some images, of course, of Coronado on the right. That's an actual painting, I think, later done by the artist Frederick Remington. I want to say in the early 20th century it was right there. But he would explore New Mexico, Arizona, and also the Great Plains, all the way, they think, at one point to Kansas, believe it or not. Coronado had about 300 conquistadors with him, and he also brought along some Indian allies from the state of Slash Collins, called, or Slash Collins, they were called. And you can see there, they actually brought herds of livestock with them, which is part of why a lot of the livestock, you ever see longhorns they have in Texas and all that? That's why they end up there, cattle and horses, of course, in the American West. That's the route they took. Some of his men also explored up into not just northern Mexico, but the Gulf of California, which, by the way, Cortes had explored before, a few years before. Originally, the Gulf of California was called the Sea of Cortes. And anyway, his men explored crossing into Mexico, into Arizona. And you can see there, they first explored the eastern, northern part of Arizona. And then you can see they pushed eastward into what is New Mexico now today. And as he pushed eastward or northward, he encountered these Native Americans that were called Pueblo Indians, you may have heard about, which are Native American cultures that are in the Southwest. A lot of them were like the Zuni and the Hopi, you may have heard of. And a lot of them lived in adobe mud huts or houses, which are kind of famous for the Southwest, like these that you're looking at right there. And so he really thought that these peoples were maybe part of these, lost cities of gold, Cibola. And he was pretty ruthless, Coronado, as he conquered, into that area. He forced them to convert to Catholicism. Like if they didn't convert, he sometimes would kill them on the spot. Coronado, I guess death, either convert or die by the sword, that kind of thing. And so, if you see that map there, his men got all the way to eventually where the Kansas River is in Kansas. He actually had this guide with him that was kind of famous. His name was the Turk. He was some kind of Native American Indian. And the Turk kind of, I think they say he led Coronado's expedition on a wild goose chase, taking them away from a lot of the major cities that were, I guess, or villages that were in New Mexico and Arizona. And he got fed up with him and killed him, if you know about this. But you can see in that map there, he does reach at one point, what he calls it Quivera, I think, where basically the Kansas River, where Salina, Kansas is at that point. You can see they actually go through the panhandle of also Texas at one point as they go. The panhandle of Texas and Oklahoma as they go into Kansas and the Great Plains, but they don't end up finding, of course, any gold. Actually, in Arizona, there is a deal, if you know about this, where one of his conquistadors, a man named Garcia Lopez de Cardenas, finds the Grand Canyon, which is part of the Colorado River Basin that's there today. And so that was something that was considered kind of a famous feat, I guess, of Coronado's expedition there. And so those are some of the first Europeans to really sight the Grand Canyon, that big hole in the ground that's there today, which of course is a big tourist destination in the United States. It's about a mile deep. So if you fall off there, you're pretty much going to die. Like I think every year people fall off it and die, pretty much with the Grand Canyon. But Spanish supposedly weren't that impressed with it, even though the views are gorgeous. They were unimpressed because they couldn't find any gold. That was the thing. So they'll later find gold, but probably through mining, things like that. Now, of course, I'm going to talk about next Hernan Cortes. I'm going to, of course, get last thing we'll talk about today on this part one lecture. I'll kind of get into his conquest of Mexico and of course the Aztecs, of course, which is something he became real famous for overall. This, of course, happens in the early 1500s. It takes him about 2 or 3 years to conquer Mexico in the Aztec Empire. He would also later explore parts of northern Mexico as well. Here's an image, of course, of Hernan Cortes. Some people call him Hernando Cortes, but he preferred Hernan. Sometimes you'll see Cortes with a Z. Well, usually it's spelled with an S, primarily. A little bit about him. He was born originally in Medellin, Spain, which is kind of like in the western part of Spain today. And Cortes was not a soldier like most of these conquistadors that went to the Americas. He actually was, I think, going to law school at the time, and he was actually a trained notary. I think he made a living as a notary at one point. But what happened was Cortes heard about how Columbus and his expeditions had discovered parts of the Americas and all that. And so that influenced Cortes to go to the New World and, seek his fortune. And so he first went to, I think he went to Cuba first. Actually, he went to Hispaniola first and then Cuba. And I think for a while he was an Encomienda. He had he was a colonist and owned land in Cuba. But he had his main ambitions, of course, eventually, which was to eventually conquer Mexico, is what he will eventually do. Now, I'll kind of talk about a little bit about Cortes. Cortes will eventually invade with a small force. I think he had only like 500 men when he eventually left Cuba. 11 ships. I think the governor of Cuba, I think Velasquez, I think was his name, tried to stop him at that point when he does invade. And because I think he didn't have an official commission to go in there and really do it, but he would invade through the Yucatan, and that's when he first encounters like the Aztecs and also the Maya that are there in that part of Mexico. And one of the first things he does when he gets there, he acquires a bunch of slave girls, which there's one that's very famous that he gets, which is a native woman. They called different names, either Donna Marina, I think was one of the names that they called her, who would help kind of Cortes conquer Mexico. She would basically be like his interpreter that would help him to, do this. She was called all kinds of names. Some people called her La Malinche, which I think was a name that meant the captain's woman, because it was like his mistress and lover. And La Malinche or Donna Marina had actually one son with Cortes, who was named Martin Cortes, who was considered the first major mestizo, like a mixed race. And Donna Marina, she knew Maya and also Nahuatl, which was the Aztec language. And so this kind of gave Cortes kind of an advantage overall. She was also called Malinche, which I think is a variation of Malinche also as well. So she's been dramatized, romanticized, and I think some people in Mexico don't like her. They kind of see her as evil, helping Cortes to conquer Mexico and things like that. At least probably the Indians, I'm sure, do that. But she's kind of a well-known figure that was kind of, I guess, on Cortes' side with him. Here's the route that Cortes took as he came up from the Yucatan. He landed near Veracruz, which he helped found the city of Veracruz on the Gulf of Mexico. And then with his men, with some, I guess, Indian allies that backed him, he took a route across, you see, central Mexico. And I'll get to it later, but he's going to gain a bunch of allies with him. Like there's one city you can see there called Tlaxcala. I think it's there. That city and a few other Native American cities back Cortes because they don't like the Aztecs and all that. And so that kind of was part of why Cortes was able to conquer, Mexico because of Native American allies that supported him. Eventually, he's going to enter Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan, if you know about this, was the capital of the Aztec Empire, which is now located where Mexico City is. The Aztec Empire was a Native American alliance of Aztec peoples that kind of was a confederation that controlled that region of the Valley of Mexico. And they were called different names. They were called the Nahuatl people, or some people call them the Mexica or Mexicanos. I think is another variation that they were called also as well. And it's a very famous city. In fact, considered one of the greatest cities probably in the Americas before the pre-Columbian period, before the Europeans came. And it was built actually on this lake called Lake Texcoco, which is on an island where it had these causeways that ran to it. And it was considered to be a highly advanced city and culture. And so here's other images of it with step pyramids and things like that constructed. And so he would arrive in 1519, and at the time that the ruler of the Aztec Empire was this ruler named Montezuma or Moctezuma, usually called Montezuma II, who was the second to last reigning ruler of the Aztecs. He had been in power for almost 20 years at that point. And a lot of the people didn't really like him. I think he reigned as a tyrant. A lot of these, I think, rulers were absolutists that they reigned by. But I think they hated the Europeans worse. But Cortes claimed that when he arrived, Montezuma thought that he was actually a god, Cortes. There was this famous god called Quetzalcoatl, you may have heard of, the so-called feather serpent god of the Aztecs. And there was a legend that one day he would return to Mexico because he had been banished. And he supposedly was supposed to look like a white man, and like have a chalky white face and all that. And so that was basically, it gave Cortes like an advantage because of this. And so one of the first things I guess that he did when Cortes arrived, he basically put him up in his own palace because he thought he was a god, all that kind of deal. And so Cortes was able to take advantage of this. And so over time, what ends up happening is Cortes eventually takes Montezuma under his control and makes him into like a puppet, is what he does. And I think at one point he threatened to kill him, like if he didn't do whatever he said. And so that's between 1519 to 1520. He will try to take over the Aztecs at their capital. Here's kind of a image. There's been a lot of paintings and depictions of the two meeting, the two different worlds, old and new worlds, I guess, meeting. November 8th, 1519. That's the famous date when Cortes met Montezuma and Tenochtitlan. Here's another more larger sized image right there. There's actually a location in the old heart of Mexico City where they actually met. It's called the Hospital de Jesus Nazareno, which supposedly was a hospital that Cortes had built after he conquered Mexico. I think it was built as a hospital to help wounded soldiers that had gotten hurt when they conquered it. But I think he felt remorseful too about the conquest, and maybe that's why he built it. Cortes was later buried there. That's where his tomb is today. Believe it or not in Spain. And it was kind of like a courtyard area. of the hospital. It is famous for some murals that are there, which I think one of I thought I had some murals I had showing you the depictions. I guess I don't. You kind of see them in the background right there, but I think they were, I want to say, painted in the 1940s that are there. But that's the actually meeting spot where they actually met and all that. Now, the only thing was the people, if you study about the Aztecs did not trust Cortes, and they thought that Montezuma was like becoming this puppet to basically Cortes. And so what happened was they eventually rebelled against Montezuma, and supposedly they killed him. They killed Montezuma, and what happened was what occurred after Cortes had tried to seize power. The Aztecs then rebelled in the end of June. I think June 30th is the date, or the night of June 30th. I think 1520. The Aztecs rebelled in what the Spanish called later La Noche Trista, which in Spanish has different translations: the sad night, the night of sorrows, or the night of tears. I think it was also pouring down raining at the time. And so what happened was, if you look at this image there, Cortes and his men with some of his Indian allies had to flee across one of the drawbridges there, and half his men didn't make it. A bunch of them were captured or killed by the Aztecs. And I don't know if you know about this, but the Aztecs were known for doing human sacrifice. They took a lot of the captives and they brought them to I think it's the Pyramid of the War God, which is Huitzilopochtli, and ripped their hearts out. And I think it decapitated them too, cut their heads off. And so Cortes was able to escape. And so he got to the other side of the Lake Texcoco at that point. And he got to where that tree is right there, the top right there. It's called the Tree of Sad Night, which I think it's a saber tree. Is what type of tree it is. It's an old tree. It's still there, Mexico City. Like the ruins of, I guess, what's left of it at that point. From there, he kind of gathered up the rest of his men, and he had to flee to what is the slash Collins, the city of Slash Calla, which was nearby, to I guess in the north of Tenochtitlan. And what happened was he got his Indian allies together, and they came back. They basically came back and reconquered the capital of the Aztecs, which that took place in the spring summer of 1521. It was a siege that took place over like 3 months or so. And the Aztecs had never really experienced any kind of form of siege warfare. This is something that was kind of new to them and all that. It's often referred to as the fall of Tenochtitlan. And Cortes was kind of genius. One of the things he did, which is very famous, he built ships in the middle of land. Like he cut down a bunch of trees, and he built, like, I think he called them brigantines, and he dragged them to where the shores of the Lake Texcoco is, laid siege to the city, and basically starved them out. Is what he did. And eventually they did have one last ruler that was like a brother of Montezuma. I think it's pronounced Quitlawak, I think his name is, who reigned only, you can see, like 80 days or so in 1520. He would actually surrender his forces to Cortes at that point. And the conquest of the Aztec Empire cost a lot of casualties. I think that's the number right there. 40,000 or more Aztecs were killed. They think the casualties may have been higher, like maybe even close to like 100,000, basically, in the whole conquest of Mexico and all that. And so that's something that Cortes is kind of known for, his ruthless conquest of it and all that. And so, yeah, that's the only thing about these, conquistadors. They're swashbuckling. It's not like buccaneers and all that, but yeah, I guess to the Native Americans, some of them today don't like them because of what they did, of course, with the conquest. But what happened after that, Mexico, you get Mexico City, will kind of eventually come after that will be founded pretty much. I think I've got images showing. Here's some areas of, by the way, you're looking at right there. You see here some of the actual ruins of the old Mexico City where Tenochtitlan was. Supposedly there was a great pyramid that was there, pyramid to the war god, which they supposedly, which I think they tore down because the Spanish didn't really like the fact that the Aztecs were considered cannibals, pagans, not Christian, and things like that. Human sacrifice and all that, which they thought was ridiculous. And anyway, from there, from the ashes of this, they'll build Mexico City on top of the old city of Tenochtitlan, and that'll become the capital of the Viceroyalty of New Mexico. Actually, sorry, New Spain, excuse me, New Spain, which is later Mexico. And Cortes, I think, was eventually its first governor for a while, although he left actual Mexico and went back to Spain at one point. Here's images, of course, of some of the ruins that's Teotihuacan, you may have heard of, which is kind of like to the northeast of I think it's north of Mexico City, and that's actually was an old city that went back. I want to say going back to like 200 CE. That was built by the Teotihuacans, which were ancient ancestors of the Aztecs. They were taken over by the Toltecs and the Aztecs, and so Aztecs, I think, at one point used those as temples and things like that as well. But the Pyramid of the Sun you see in the background is one of the largest Mesoamerican pyramids that was ever constructed, of course, in the Americas. Yeah, Mexico City, there's images of it, of course, right there. Of course, one of the largest cities, of course, in the New World, of course, if you know about that. So Mexico City right there. Later, I'm of course not now. I guess I'll wait into, of course, next week because it'll probably take a while to get into that. But I'll talk later about the conquest of Peru, which was done by Francisco Pizarro. He's pretty ruthless too. If you look at conquest of America, Pizarro probably conquered the most wealth when he conquered the Inca Empire in Peru and South America. He's pretty ruthless. He does kill a lot of indigenous peoples as they conquer into that part of the Americas. So we'll talk about that. We'll also talk about how also the Spanish are going to, after all this, spearheading of the conquest of America, they're going to start trying to colonize, like Latin America, mostly parts of North America as well. So we'll talk about that, of course, later. Now, I'm, of course, going to continue talking about the Spanish, how they, come into the Americas and they conquer America. Of course, here, kind of showing you kind of a map of the Americas right here. On the left, you can see all that area that's pretty much in green. There is going to be an area that's going to be conquered eventually by the Spanish, pretty much by the 18th century. They conquer a majority of that area. Other areas, of course, are not. You see Portuguese take over the area of mostly where Brazil is. They call it the so-called Viceroyalty of Brazil. But you can see from the western part of the United States, Mexico, Caribbean, Central America, most of the western part of South America are pretty much controlled by the Spanish, for quite a long time, up to like at least up to the early 1800s. They're in control of it for a while. So that's one thing I'll probably talk briefly about later because you get all these, different states that kind of emerge out of that after the so-called Latin American revolutions, of course, break out. Now, I'm going to talk about today one of the main topics, of course, we'll get to first, is talking about Francisco Pizarro. I think I hadn't quite gotten to that yet about Pizarro. You can see there Francisco Pizarro, image of him in that statue on the left. I think we kind of mentioned about him before, but Pizarro, was a famous conquistador, especially in the early 16th century, that conquered eventually what we call Peru, which is in the western part of South America. He's very famous for conquering what is the Inca Empire. The Inca Empire was one of the last of the pre-Columbian states that existed in the Americas before the Europeans came and all that. And He was actually, if you know much about Pizarro, he actually originally came to the Americas with Vasco Nunez de Balboa in 1513, when Balboa, discovered the Pacific Ocean, where Panama is now today above South America. And he was kind of instrumental in, they think, in establishing what we call Panama City, the capital of Panama today, which I think at one point he may have been a mayor at one point. But early on, Pizarro had heard about some kind of El Dorado, which was in South America, and so starting way back in the 1520s, he started several expeditions to try to go down into Peru, into South America, which for like 3 or 4 years were not successful at all. He attempted several times to go down there, and it was a total failure. And I think he ended up on an island off the coast of northern Peru, or might have been actually Ecuador. And there's a famous image you may have kind of show here of Pizarro right here on the right, but you can see he's going to get down to eventually down to where Peru is. You can see on the left, right there in that image, I guess pushing down through, Colombia and into, Ecuador and Peru in that area you're looking right there. I think he was off on an island somewhere called Gayo Island with his men. There was kind of like a little foothold in the Americas at that point before they would eventually invade into South America. And a lot of his men didn't really want to go on this expedition because I guess they were dying and they felt like it wasn't going to go anywhere at all at that point. And he drew a line in the sand. The famous painting, I guess, was made years ago, showing this image where basically Pizarro challenged his men to, push inward into the Americas. And he made a famous comment, which was, there lies Peru with its riches, here Panama and its poverty. Choose each man what best becomes a brave Castilian. This 1527, I think, was the year when he made that statement. And supposedly only 13 conquistadors actually crossed that line. He drew that line in the sand, basically. I think they were later nicknamed the famous 13, or I think in Spanish, Los Trece de la Fama, I think was the other nickname they called it too in Spanish originally. But within a few years, he would, find his El Dorado. That's one thing that Pizarro will eventually do at that point. And a little background about Pizarro: he came from a little city in Spain called Trujillo, Spain, and he was actually from a very poor background. I think his, I think he didn't really know his father, if you know about this, and he was illiterate. Never really learned how to read and write, and I think for years he worked as he was a swiner, like killing pigs or something like that. Was his early life, and then the early 1500s he decided to go to the Americas and seek his fortune. And so Pizarro is really, he's really a, if you study about Pizarro, he was like really old compared to other conquistadors. I think he was in the 60s when he died, I believe, Pizarro. And so he's going to eventually search out his, so-called El Dorado that he'll eventually try to, find. He had this business partner I did want to mention that was kind of famous, named Diego del Almagro. I think early on in his career, he worked with him to seek his fortune in the Americas. I think first in Panama and then in South America. And the only thing was the two later went to loggerheads, if you know about that, after he took over Peru. And he had Almagro killed. And I think later Almagro's son killed Pizarro in return. So it was almost like the mafia, like controlling South America after the conquistadors took over Peru. And eventually the crown would have to come in and take control, which will be later. Also, they had other people involved. Pizarro had brothers that were involved. Juan, Gonzalo, Hernando, Pizarro. They were all brothers that also came from Spain and were involved in the conquest as well of Peru. And don't forget about Hernando de Soto. Hernando de Soto, we know more for discovering like the Mississippi River and all that. It was definitely one of the men that was also involved in the conquest of Peru, and he's the one that eventually would take their main capital with his forces, which is Cusco, which is a little later. Now, going back to that image I was showing earlier of the Inca Empire and what is South America, the western part of South America, right there. If you study about the Incas were a Native American Peruvian state that was way up in the Andes Mountains. Some of the Andes Mountains, I think, are like 12, 13,000 feet tall. So way up in there. And the Incas were actually called the Quechua people or Quechua people. Really Quechua, I think is how they pronounce it, which was based off of a language system that was later written down, I think, after the Spanish came in and conquered it. I think only the Maya had an actual written language in the Americas. But the Incas were led by this ruler, who I think they call it either Inca or Inca Sapa, I think is the term they use, which Incas were kind of equivalent to almost like an emperor, and they were almost seen as being part god. Because I think the main god that the Incas worship was the sun god Inti. And so the Inca ruler was seen as the son of the sun god. That's how powerful he was. And I think some people even compare the Inca rulers to like almost like the Pharaoh of Egypt or something like that. The Incas, by the way, had a massive empire. They talked about how it's 2,500 miles, I think, from north to south, from Ecuador down into Chile and all that. But they do think that the length of all the roads were actually maybe longer than some of the roads of the Roman Empire, like thousands of miles of roads. And most of the roads were actually up in the mountains of the Andes. That was the amazing thing about, of course, the Inca Empire. But Pizarro would eventually push down into Peru by 1532. In fact, Pizarro had a smaller force than Cortes. I think Cortes maybe had 500 conquistadors or more. I think Pizarro was like 200 men or more that he might have had. So he had a much smaller force that he eventually would, take basically Peru at that point. And what happened was he eventually came to a city. If you look at, you start where Tumbas is, which is like a little town that's kind of in the northern part of Peru. Then he pushed down to that city called Cajamarca, you can see, which is kind of like north of Cusco. And eventually he battled against the Inca ruler in that city, the Battle of Cajamarca. And the Incas thought they were going to just meet basically some kind of parlay between the Incas and the Spanish, because the Incas didn't really know much about the Spanish and who they were. And the Spanish would, of course, if you know about it, introduce, of course, the Inca ruler. We'll kind of show here. Where is he? I think he's right there. Atahualpa. Atahualpa, of course, was the Inca, one of the last Inca emperors that you have. And the meeting took place, of course, in November of 1532 between the Spanish and the Incas. And one of the first things that the Spanish tried to do with Atahualpa was they tried to basically, hey, this is our religion, Christianity, and they basically showed in the Bible and that you need to convert to, to our traditional religions. And I think they say that what happened was Atahualpa looked at the Bible, spit on it, and threw it on the ground like it was nothing. And so the Spanish basically used that as a I guess a means to attack the Incas. And like I said, they would eventually captured Atahualpa at the Battle of Cajamarca. And so with that, they basically cut the head off of the snake. And they were able to basically take control of the Inca Empire. There's a very famous story that they always talk about, which I'll kind of discuss here. Of course, is the image of kind of like the Battle of Cajamarca, which, by the way, the Incas later kind of view it as being like a massacre, really. And so forget how many Incas were killed in the battle, but it was several thousand. but it would eventually lead to the fall of Cusco, which you see here in that image right there. Cusco would fall right afterwards, with Hernando de Soto's forces, I think, taking it right after. But to try and save, if you know about Atahalpa, the Incas decided to ransom him. Is what they did. They had this famous ransom room or house you're looking at right there, which is in actually Cajamarca. And Atahalpa agreed to give the Spanish tons of gold and silver if they would free him. I guess not kill him or whatever. And I forget the exact number, but they seem to think that the ransom amount was 24 tons or something like that of gold and silver. And supposedly the room size was about 432 square foot, is what I calculated how size the room was. So I think a legend is they drew a line on the wall and told the Spanish that he would fill the whole room with gold and silver, and they didn't believe him that he could do that, but he did. But they do think that the amount of gold and silver that the actual Incas had was way more. We're talking like, I think there's an estimate that maybe they have like 700 tons of gold and silver. Now, a lot of it that the Spanish never got. They reneged on the ransom thing. And I think there's a legend of the so-called lost Inca gold you may have heard of, where they hid most of it in the Andes Mountains, and the Spanish never found it. And I think people have been looking for it for like several centuries, trying to find it. Of course, part of why they reneged on it, if you know about, was that they eventually they had him killed. If you know about this, Atahalpa, of course, here in that image right there, was eventually executed in the next year. They were actually going to burn him at the stake, but they said that if he would basically convert to Christianity, that they would have him strangled instead. And so he was what they call garroted. If you know what that is, it's a type of strangulation device where they basically suffocate you and kill you right there. And so they sat him in a contraption like that and turned that thing until it basically strangles and suffocates you to death. So that's how Atahalpa was basically killed. And a lot of people thought it was just awful what they did with that, the Spanish, by killing Atahalpa at that point. So that's kind of what occurred with that, with the Spanish doing that. So with that, they're able to, the Spanish are then able to then take over, basically, or at least to try to take over Peru, which they will at that point. By the way, they have made movies about the conquest of the Incas and what happened to Atahalpa. I think the most famous movie ever made was in 1969, which was based off of a play by this man named Peter Schaefer, and it was called The Royal Hunt of the Sun. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's got Robert Shaw, who plays Pizarro. I think Robert Shaw is more known for playing in like the movie Jaws. You ever seen the movie Jaws? And then Christopher Plummer played Atahalpa, of course, on the right. I think that's kind of a scene on the right, showing the ransom thing where he's going to give him the ransom money and all that. Of course, they let him go, but of course, he reneged on it, and Pizarro had him killed, of course, is what happened. So, kind of a tragic story about what happened with Atahalpa. Of course, if you know about Pizarro, Pizarro is very famous for founding Peru. Peru, if you know about it, later, Lima is the main capital, which is on the Pacific Ocean, largest city pretty much in Peru today. I think that's the actual official date of when Peru was originally founded, January 18th, 1535. And so from there, the Spanish are going to start conquering, South America and expanding it and creating Peru becomes like the other viceroyalty colony that they have, of course, in the New World, besides, of course, New Spain overall. Now, I'm also going to talk about two other things that happen as well. It wasn't over. That's one of the weird things about what occurred with Pizarro's conquest of of basically of Peru at that point. They do have this other incident that happens right afterwards, which was the it's called different names. I think they call it the Inca Rebellion of 1536, but I think in South America they also call it the Great Inca Rebellion as well. And what happened after Pizarro took over Cusco and they had killed Atahalpa at that point, they put in this puppet ruler who was named Manco Inca, who was, I think, like a brother. I think he was kind of related to Atahalpa, like a brother, a half brother. And he would be like the puppet ruler for several years afterwards, from the 1530s, I think, up to the 1540s, supposedly, although he rebelled against him. And I think 1544 is when he died. And anyway, what happened was they mistreated Manco Inca. I think there was even a case where Pizarro killed his wife on top of that. And so, what happened was they rebel. Like the rebellion itself would last like something like 9 months, and it led to the so-called siege of Cusco, which was the main part of it. Where what happened was the Incas, in a massive army, which I don't know if it was that big, 200,000 warriors, at least 100,000 at the most, they think it was. They took back the capital of Cusco, and Pizarro had to get reinforcements to try to take it back. And Anyway, it led to a lot of atrocities on both sides that were committed. They fought over this huge fortress that was in Cusco called Sacsayhuaman, which you see right there. In fact, the Incas tried to hold out at that site. You're looking there, and you can see some of the massive stonework that they were talking about Machu Picchu. Some of those stones you're looking at weighed like almost like 100 tons to kind of give you an idea of their weight. And that was one thing that really impressed the Spanish about all the stonework that they had there. A lot of the stones were actually taken away from that site and was used to build later what is now the Spanish Cusco city that will be built, of course, later afterwards. But yeah, his forces eventually were defeated. That's the one thing about Manco Inca. He wasn't really able to defeat the Spanish forces. Also, disease, I think, like smallpox and so on, decimated his forces, and they couldn't handle the Spanish firepower and all that. And so, what happened was Manco Inca eventually fled to like the jungles of Peru, and he eventually forms a new state, which I guess the term they use for it is the Neo Inca state with its capital at Vilcabamba, which is actually kind of a region of Peru. I think it's in the eastern or southern part of Peru today. And Vilcabamba was this city that he basically reconstructed in the jungles of Peru, like it's I think close to the headwaters of the Amazon, and it became known as the lost city of the Incas. And For years, the Spanish couldn't find it, but eventually they would. They would have to move it. And I think there was another site called Vitkos, which was kind of nearby. Rosapata, I think is another name they called it. And later they actually would live there as well. I think sometimes Vitkos is kind of confused with the original Vilcabamba, which is now ruins in the jungles. But Eventually they found Manco Inca, and he was eventually killed. Is what happened. They did have a few other rulers afterwards that reigned until like the 1570s that were there. There's some few others you may have heard of. There was one named Tita Cusi that reigned, and then one of the last ones that reigned you may have heard of was Tupac Amaru, who reigned over this Neo Inca state up to like 1572. He was, I think, some of the last rulers later were like the sons of Manco Inca that kind of struggled onward to try to continue this this Inca state that was separate from what the Spanish were building to the, I guess, to the north or west. And so after he was captured too and murdered. Um, Pretty much after that, the Spanish start taking over all of South America minus Brazil. You may have heard of that name, Tupac Amaru. It's of course a famous rapper. Of course, was named that. Of course, later, and that's kind of where the name originated from the Americas a long time ago. So, so anyway, kind of talking about what happened, with the Pizarro's conquest, of course, of Peru, which was very bloody. He did kill off a lot of the indigenous peoples, and he got very wealthy off of it, but he didn't live much to see it because he was murdered by his own men. That's the only thing about that. Oh, of course, they were talking about in the video about Machu Picchu. Apparently, the Spanish never found it because of the fact that the Incas had abandoned it right before the Spanish actually came. And so for a long time, it was unknown. Very few people knew about this citadel that was high up in the Andes Mountains until really 1911 when Hiram Bingham, who was an American archaeologist and professor, found it, of course. And so that's what became a wide known thing now. It's a big tourist attraction, of course, today, as you know, in Peru. So I'm going to, of course, move on. We're gonna talk more about some other things, of course, what happened after, of course, the initial conquests of Peru, which of course keep going. They could conquer the rest of South America as well. We also have to look into, of course, the different colonies that were set up by the Spanish after this, of course, all occurred with the conquistadors coming in. The initial conquest, at least in the 16th century, spawned the first really Spanish colonial viceroyalties that are created afterwards. The two main ones, which I kind of already talked a little bit about, New Spain, which New Spain was composed of predominantly like Mexico and part of Western, like America now today. Caribbean was in it. I think later it includes Central America, and it did include the Philippines, by the way, with Mexico City being its main capital or main largest city that was in that part of their colonial system. And then Peru initially, Peru really included like all of like just about South America was in it, minus Brazil. But it would later be broken up. Lima, of course, the main city that was the capital of that. But you can see how the Portuguese had their own separate like colony they had in Brazil, which was all because of the Treaty of Tordesillas. They were able to establish that, of course, in that area. Of course, the viceroyalties were all divided into different, like a hierarchy from top to bottom. The king obviously was the head of the whole colonial system, who ruled really from Spain. But in his place, you had what they call a viceroy. A viceroy was like a royal governor appointed by him that basically advised the chief executives and carried out all the laws, basically of basically their empire. And then under the viceroy, they had like a what they call the real audiencia, which means in Spanish, royal audience is what it means. It was a combination of like a court system with a council running basically the different aspects of their empire, not just in the Americas, but pretty much old world and Philippines and so on. They had different court systems too. You can see audiencias were the judicial councils, and then you had what they call corregidors under them, which were like municipal or local court systems that they had. Then on the bottom, you can see they had what they call the cabildo. And the cabildo was like a colonial council that basically ran the colony. Usually it was in a building called the Cabildo Building, which you may have, if you've ever been on the Jackson Square, next to St. Louis Cathedral, you got the famous Cabildo Building that's down there, which is now a museum. That's where the Spanish ran the, Louisiana colonial colony they had here back in the late 18th century. That's how basically they ran everything pretty much within the Spanish Empire. And of course, most people that controlled it, if you know about it, were mostly people from Spain, which I'll get to later. They're called peninsulars, is the nickname they're often called. Now, of course, one thing about the Spanish Empire, they began to break up uh, pretty much their whole empire into like a caste system, which it has different names. I think the term Spanish caste system or casta system is, I think, the English name that they use, which I think they also use that in India. That term was also kind of popular as well. But it was basically this type of system that was a hierarchical system that was based off of race, ethnicity, where they divided the colonial population based on their heritage, like who they're related to, and all that. And all this occurred, by the way, because of the fact that the Spanish came to the Americas and you had different populations that were there. You had people that were Indian, you had people that were African that were brought in, and you had people that were like a mixed race that were also existing as well. So the top, you had the peninsular with the Criollo or Creoles. Then you had your mestizos. Then you had your Indians and Africans. And then you had a mixed type race like mulatto, etc., that you had as well. A lot of people like Indians, Africans were used, of course, a lot for a lot of the labor, either free labor or slave labor, of course, either one. A lot of times they use the term Creole, of course, we use, which is more of a French term, but the Spanish say Criollo is the term that they use. But yeah, the differences between the two, by the way, your peninsulars would basically be, European-born Spanish, or I guess even Portuguese, that were born in the old world. They were born on the Iberian Peninsula, hence the term being used. And so these were people that were born in Spain or Portugal. And then Creoles would be people that were like mostly European that are born in America. So they would be the offspring of, say, Pizarro had children or whatever with another Spanish person. That would be considered a Criollo. But Creole is more like the French term, of course, that they used later as well. Mestizo, of course, you have that. That's a racial mixture, which is kind of a mix of European and Indian. You see that a lot in the Americas, like especially like in Mexico, etc. And so, but it all depends on the parentage. So you could be more European or more Indian. Like they had a term, like if you were more Spanish, you were called a castizo. We would be I think I've got the term, but castizo is, I think, usually considered to be 3/4 Spanish, and then you'd be 1/4 Indian, and that's what they call a castizo. And if you're a woman, it's a castiza, is what they would use. So mulatto, mulatta, the difference between male and female, that kind of thing. Mulatto is also a term too they use. It's a racial mixture of African and European. Which it could be different things: Spanish, French, Portuguese, whatever. It could be Creole, but that's basically the term they used. And I think that's still used in pretty much Latin America. That term overall. They do have what they call a Zambo. I think it's called. You may have heard of. Sometimes a derogatory term, but they do use it in Latin America still. A Zambo is something who's a mixture of like African Indian, which is kind of considered mulatto sometimes too, the way as well. But yeah, your people that are African, Indian, those two, like I said, were considered to be in the lowest part of the caste system. They are often used as the main labor force overall. So first Indians and then Africans were later brought in the 16th century. Here's, by the way, some images showing you the caste system. Actually, it's really weird, but the Spanish actually made paintings showing the difference between the different classes of people. So you can see they kind of get from light to dark. They get darker as they go down to the bottom. And so, yeah, a lot of it was based off of like their race, ethnicity, and their mixture and all that. And so you see that there and pretty much in Latin America, and you see it a lot in course, North America later, and also, of course, in like in India and all that. Now they have also this thing you may have heard of called the Encomienda system, which was very famous, and of course was created by the Spanish. This is something. This is a system that they think was developed under Christopher Columbus when Columbus first came to the Americas. And if you know much about the Encomienda system, it was really a system that was disguised as slavery. Is basically what it was. If you go back to that image right there, the idea was that Spanish colonialists that were coming to the Americas would be there to protect the Indians, make them like Spanish, teach them Spanish, Christianize them. It was one of the, of course, main things that they used them for. By the way, Spanish colonialists that came there were often called encomienderos, I think was the term that they used. But in the end, a lot of them were used for slave labor, which it turned out to be. And they think this labor system, in a sense, along with all the European diseases that they had, helped to wipe out a majority of the indigenous peoples in Latin America, which kind of debates how many it was. I think there's been all kinds of estimates about how many people died, because of the Spanish, their labor systems and so on, and the diseases. But I think the estimates range from 2 to 15 million. They're not really sure how many died. It's kind of a debate about how many indigenous peoples were in the Americas. I've seen crazy numbers as high as 100 million, but they're not really sure if it was that many that were there. But that's the estimate they had. But they do think that the income system was pretty much begun under the time of Columbus, and then it spread and became more like a plantation system, over time. So yeah, they think Columbus started in Hispaniola. I think was the idea of where it was, where he took all the Taino peoples, the Indians there, enslaved them, and all that. But a lot of the enslavement and the diseases, of course, led to mass deaths, of basically of all those peoples. So what happened was a lot of the priests, like Catholic priests, were really just kind of they were really shocked by the the amount of deaths or decimation of the Native American populations, and so there's a very famous Spanish priest and missionary that had come to the Americas named Bartholomew de las Casas, and Las Casas was the one that really worked to have Indian slavery banned in the 16th century, and so it was all because of a series of laws that were passed in 1542 under Emperor Charles V called the New Laws of 1542. And what it did was it banned Indian slavery within a generation. And you know about Las Casas, he was involved in this famous debate in Spain that became real known. It was called the Valladolid debate. And it became this moral debate about the rights and the treatment of Native Americans in the New World. The debate was like, how should they be treated? Like other Spanish, or should they be treated like they're subhuman or slaves, that kind of thing? And there were two sides. You had Bartholomew de las Casas, who argued that basically the Spanish ought to treat them like equally because of the fact that they had converted to, Christianity. They were trying to become more like the Spanish. And then they had another man that opposed it, Juan de Sepulveda, and he said that they ought to be enslaved because the fact that were heathens that originally weren't Christian. They had practiced human sacrifice and things like that. And so I guess he was saying that they deserved to be, enslaved and things like that. But Las Casas would eventually win out if you know about that. Las Casas was, by the way, famous for writing a book about the Spanish, I guess, the colonial aspect of the Caribbean and how their policies led to a lot of mass deaths where a majority of the population were killed off. And the book was called Brief Account of the Devastation of the Indies. they think that book had a lot to do with why the Encomienda system was later abolished. But there's a lot of irony with it. If you know about Las Casas, he is controversial because of the fact that he was one of the first to say that what they ought to do is get rid of Indian slavery and replace with African slavery, and that's what the Spanish did. If you know about that, starting between the 16th and 17th centuries, and so that's basically what led to that later. And they would use a lot of African slavery, you know about that, to work on plantations, especially with like sugar. Sugar is going to be the big thing, like sugar cane and all that. And that's something you're going to see a lot with the Portuguese and also the Spanish in the Americas. They call it white gold, if you know about that, sugar. What happened was it got replaced by this other system they had, which was called the Repartimiento system, which became big in the 1500s. It was a type of labor system where they required the natives to work a specific amount of months in the year. And so it's kind of considered like a tribute labor tax, would be a kind of like what it was called. And it was kind of like a cross between, I don't know if you ever heard of the Corvée system. It was a type of labor tax system in Europe where you would have to give like so much labor to the king. It's almost like feudalism in a sense. And the Incas had something similar called the Mita tax system, where labor tax system, where basically the Incas had to give so much labor toward the Inca, like I guess for farming or whatever, throughout the year. And so it's kind of a cross between that is what it was. But a lot of people think it was like almost like disguised slavery is what it really was, in a sense. And I think a lot of the Spanish didn't really like it in the end because the fact that basically they were only working a few months out of the year. They needed to work all year round. And so what happened was the repartimiento system then evolved into like a so-called hacienda system or plantation system, which is the main thing, where they have these large, massive estates, which are used kind of like almost like in Roman times. Like, remember about the Roman latifundia, like plantations they have, where they grow a lot of cash crops and they export things. And so that's basically what the hacienda system was, in a sense. And the Indians were, they weren't considered slaves. They were, paid wages, but of course they were small wages. They weren't paid enough, if you know about this. And the kind of crops they grew that were big, besides sugar cane, if you know about that, cotton, coffee was big, and tobacco. And of course, also they had a lot of these hacienda systems could be not just a plantation, but could be like a factories. It could be mines, and so on. You also had like cattle ranches that were huge. Sometimes called ranchos, I think was the term they used in Spanish as well. And so that's the system that the Spanish pretty much have up through the colonial system. And a lot of these systems, by the way, the hacienda is still around. Like in parts of the Americas, they still have these huge land estates, cattle ranches, or whatever that are still down there. Now, I did want to talk about one more thing too about this period. They do have the Spanish colonial period really takes off afterwards. If you know about this period, the Spanish really begin to have a colonial boom in Latin America. In fact, I think around 1810, that was the peak of the Spanish Empire, which peaked at over 5 million square miles. So it at one point was one of the largest empires in the world. The only thing about that was that there was like a lot of this negativity that was surrounded about the Spanish conquest of the Americas and the colonial system they set up. But you can see, like I said before, the massive area that they controlled at one point from like basically the western part of the United States through Mexico, Caribbean, all the way down into South America. They controlled this whole area for 330 something years or something like that at one point. But there was a so-called legend you may have heard of called the Black Legend, where some people thought that the Spanish Empire had been built on things like cruelty and so on, and the use of like slave labor, etc. But it was really considered like an anti-Catholic anti-Spanish propaganda that was circulated throughout Europe. I think, especially by the British, but all empires, have exploited people and has been cruel also as well. But I think a lot of this kind of went back to like the Spanish Inquisition and the conquest of the Americas, kind of is what kind of gave people that idea, about the Spanish and all that. But it's still a legacy that they're kind of trying to live up to in all that. Chad, you can see here the Spanish, one thing they did do, they began to exploit all the gold and silver mining. The Spanish, it was like part of why the boom happened was because of gold and silver mining, which took place in pretty much from Mexico down into Peru. And so that helped to really make a lot of people leave Spain. I think close to, I want to say something like 3 million people or more left Spain at one point and immigrated either to the Americas or to the rest of their empire as well. And so the Spanish crown took advantage of this. If you know about this, they basically taxed all the actual mineral rights and so on. And they had this tax that they called sometimes Quinto Real, or also known as Quinto del Rey, which either means royal fifth or the king's fifth. And at first, the tax was pretty high. It was like 20%, like whatever you mined or whatever. They basically tax it at a 20% rate, although it was later declined to 10% or less over time. But that was considered a good chunk of the Spanish Empire's revenue. But the only problem with what you know about the whole Spanish Empire was that I think Castile was the only state that was really viable that made decent money. The rest of their states in Spain didn't really make much money. And so later it led to the empire decline. If you know about it, over time, their empire is really rivaled by other states that are really more powerful, like the British and the French, and so on. And so, really between the 17th and the 18th century, you start seeing the Spanish Empire really start to decline after that, which a lot of it was due to a lot of issues. They had all kinds of problems, the Spanish economic problems they had where it was not run very well financially. In fact, they had trouble with a lot of inflation like today. And in fact, I think for several times the Spanish government went bankrupt, which was kind of bad. Also, we'll get to a lot of their military losses. I think the defeat of the Spanish Armada, if you know about that, which happened in 1588, was a major issue, of course, as well. But also brain drain. In fact, a lot of people left Spain, of course, to the Americas and other parts of their empire, and that didn't help either as well. But that picture you're looking at there is kind of the root of the treasure fleets. They would have all these, Spanish galleons, these huge treasure ships that would basically ship gold, silver back and forth between the Americas and Spain. I think some of the main ports are kind of shown there, like Havana and Cuba. You got Veracruz and Acapulco, of course, in Mexico. Panama City was kind of deemed as an important port of theirs, the Spanish, as well as Lima. You can see also shows a lot of the fleets of the Portuguese too, between South America, Africa, and of course in Asia. Yeah, the Spanish, starting in the 16th century, began to build these huge multi-deck ships, which are called a galleon. The word galleon is a word that means large ship. It's really the first of these multi-deck ships that used 3 or more masts. And the average Spanish galleon might weigh up to like something like 500 tons, to give you an idea of the massive size of these ships. And, compared to like the caravels and the carracks, which we had talked about before, the average crew of a Spanish galleon or any kind of galleon ship, kind of similar to that, maybe other European powers, I think the average crew was like somewhere between 200 to 300 men, to give you an idea. Of course, it was known for having a lot of guns on it. I think the average Spanish galleon had like 20 guns on each side, so 40 guns total. And so, yeah, that obviously could blast people away with that or ships. And so that's something that the Spanish used to really have naval supremacy, of course, of the world at that time. Eventually, you see here, though, kind of on the left, you got the Spanish Empire. You got, um, I kind of showed you before, but over time, the Spanish, their empire, they would lose a grip on it by the turn of the 18th into the 19th centuries. What happened was a lot of it was caused by Latin American revolutions, which occurred really starting going back to like Haiti, I think was the initial, I think, location of like some of the early rebellions. Then it spread to Mexico, then into South America. And a lot of it was spurred on by different influence, the American Revolution, the Age of Enlightenment. You also had the French Revolution, and then they say the last thing that really caused it, of course, was the um, Napoleon. Napoleon taking over France, and Napoleon at one point took over Spain and Portugal as he expanded his, Napoleonic Empire. And so that caused a lot of the peoples in Latin America to rebel against the colonial system. And so eventually you get all these different states that emerge in Latin America, which I've got a list of them here, but it's, of course, numerous ones: Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Cuba, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Ecuador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, Uruguay, and Venezuela. All those, of course, will eventually be states that will kind of emerge like around, I guess, between the 19th and 20th centuries. And a lot of those states, were heavily influenced by the Spanish, like not just their kinds of governments that they have later. The Catholic faith uh, mostly speaks Spanish, but even their not just their governments, but also even some of their court systems are kind of similar to what the Spanish had, previously. And so, yeah, a lot of Latin America today is heavily influenced by the Spanish, of course, minus Brazil. So that's kind of the whole legacy, I guess, of what happened in the Americas. Their influence there, the Spanish. I didn't really get as much into the Portuguese, but the Portuguese have a lot of also influence, of course, into modern Brazil as a state, because Brazil later break away too. It'll become like the Empire of Brazil in the 19th century, and now I think it's now like a Republican type state today.